Right, welcome everyone. I'm Dany Bahar, and this is another edition, a special edition of Conversations with Policymakers on the Frontline. And today we have Andre Perry, my friend and colleague, who I am on Instagram and waiting for him to go. And here on the other platforms, Andre, if you're there, you can put your camera.
There we go.
All right, we're connected on Instagram. There you are. But I still don't see you on the other. Maybe I don't know if your camera is off. There you are. Now we're live streaming. We're live streaming on a number of places on Instagram and on Twitter and YouTube and a bunch of other places. And I hope everybody hears us fine. I'm gonna be tracking comments if we have any. Welcome, Andre.
Hi, how are you, colleague?
Good to see you.
Friend?
Yeah, I haven't seen you in the cafeteria in a while.
Exactly.
I've seen you on the TV, and I've seen you there voicing out your very important voice and your message. So I appreciate that on behalf of a citizen of the world.
Hey, well, it's been a crazy 3 months, and we still find a place to keep pounding away at the work.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I have a book.
Andre, they're telling us, sorry to interrupt you, they're telling us that there's an echo, so maybe I think on your Instagram, on your phone, just lower the volume, and I think that should make it. And
there we go. I think that's better.
Okay, perfect. Great. So you're saying there was a very busy 3 months. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, very busy 3 months. I didn't plan to release a book in the midst of a pandemic. And during uprising, but apparently there's no bad time to release a book and some work on structural inequality in this country. So there you have it.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a sad reality, but I think it's a good point. I have your book here.
Woo!
For all of you.
You and my mother.
Bought it.
Now that there's two people with my book. No.
Yes, and I want to tell you, by the way, that in social media I've been telling about your book, and then somebody that you maybe don't know told me, why don't you lend it to me afterwards? And I said, yeah, you can borrow it, but it's my wife, so that you know that if it wasn't my wife, I would tell that person, buy your own copy.
Get your own copy.
Yeah. So but to my wife, we can do that. So Andre, you know, these are very sad circumstances. I'm an immigrant in America, and you know, I mean, this to say that, you know, there's some things of this country that I've been living here for 10 years, but there's some things that still like amaze me from start. And these past months, these past years have been like really a set of unprecedented things. And these past months in particular have been, not to say that these problems don't exist in other parts of the world, they exist everywhere. But I feel that in America, you know, I think it hurts that it still happens in America of today, after so many years of thinking that, you know, America was moving more towards equality. At least, I mean, maybe you don't agree with that, but at least superficially, one had that feeling, and you still, you know, see that very strong frustration, right?
White supremacy is a global phenomenon, but the brand of America is one that states that it's a land of opportunity, that many of our heroes have been people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, and those people are cited as people who've incited change. But when you look underneath sort of the heroes and the holidays, you find that there are many structures that still limit the economic mobility of Blacks in this country and others in this country, but it stems from the anti-Black legislation that has occurred over the centuries. And it's clear that we have yet to dismantle that architecture of inequality that hinders so many different people.
And I think that's what I want to talk, because in these video conversations I've had with people, we really try to keep it into policy, And I mean, I really like the phrase that I think your T-shirt says, that there's nothing wrong with Black people, that ending racism can't.
So,
It cannot
yeah.
solve. And you know, that makes total sense. But I think the challenge is that you have thought about a lot, and that's I guess big part of what I want to talk is how do you convert that into policies? Because
Yes.
a lot of what my understanding, and your book explains it very well, and of course, and other people I have been reading a lot and trying to educate myself, is that, you know, this didn't happen just because it's a result of centuries of policies that have resulted in Black people having, you know, many more hurdles in the way. And that's just to put it mildly, right? I mean, the people are much more likely to be killed, which is just, you know,
That's
the
right.
ultimate. And so, I mean, we at the end of the story, we're here to try to solve the issues. So I mean, I guess that I would like you to, I mean, I just don't, I want to spend some time talking about the problem, because I think people don't realize the extent to which this is a big problem. And you have worked in particular on the devaluations of lives and assets, but lives, I think I really like your perspective on how you said that. But also, you know, I want to spend some time about the policies, of course. So in terms of the problem, you know, how would you explain this to maybe an audience also that are not American or that are outside of the world, in a way that you can explain why is this such a big problem for a country that you know, if you don't solve it, it's just the country's never going to reach actually its ideal upon it was funded.
Yeah, you know, going back, the reason why I say that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve, it goes to my effort to unhinge this narrative that says that the state of Black majority neighborhoods and cities are a direct result of the individual's choices in them. And how I did that, and I want to say thank you, Dany, for being a part of my initial conceptualization team, where I sat down with a few economists and I said, hey, here's the problem. How should I set this up? But how I went about going it is I started with housing for a number of reasons. One, there's enough data on housing to get at what I'm about to describe. And two, housing in the United States is so interconnected to other policies. The prices on homes essentially determines how much revenue municipalities and states use for various services. So education, policing, infrastructure, all derived a lot from the revenues that are determined by your housing price. So what I did was I simply compared home prices.
That's just because, so that we understand, that's just in terms of the taxes mostly, right? Or
that's
there's
right.
more than that.
That's
so I mean, you
mostly
pay in America, you pay taxes based on the property of your, I mean, the property of the value of your property established, you know, determines to some extent the taxes, and taxes go into the community. So if your property is devalued, there's not a lot of taxes and there's not a lot of investment.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That there you have it. And so I looked at home prices where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. And I compared them to home prices where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. And just looking at just straight raw numbers without controlling or accounting for different conditions, homes in Black neighborhoods are roughly half as much as homes in white neighborhoods. But
a similar home with like same size, like similar size. And similar, okay.
That's right. But people will say, oh, that's because of education is worse in Black communities and crime and
that's
other
the point.
That's the point. That's right. And so I control for all those things. Now, in all those things, let's be clear, education does lower the value. Crime does lower the value. But after I controlled for all of those things, and we had an apples to apples comparison, similar social conditions and structural conditions of the home, we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are priced, the equivalent home again, priced 23% lower, about 48,000 less accumulatively. That amounts to about 156 billion in lost equity. So the money that people accrue and can tap into from increases in the value of your home over time, Black communities are essentially losing 156 billion, and that's just, we used the most recent data at that time was 2017 data. So just in 2017, 156 billion was essentially gone because of the concentration of Blackness around it. Now, people say, why is that important? Well, that 156 billion is the equivalent of, it would have paid for more than 8 million four-year college degrees at public institutions based on the average cost. It would have paid for more than, or would have started up more than 4 million businesses based on the average amount that Blacks use to start up companies. It would have covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage. It is more than double the cost of the opioid epidemic by the federal government. It's a big number. And so when we say that the conditions of Black communities are a direct result of just individual choices, you're missing the structures and that architect of inequality that's extracting wealth every day from communities. And so housing is important, like I said, because it's connected to all these other things. But I wanted to get at the cost, or that sort of what we call the Black tax of living in that's essentially
Right.
placed on people in Black communities, that there's a penalty of sorts that happens when you live in Black communities. And it certainly happens in housing, but it happens in other areas as well.
So, I mean, there, so many things come to mind, but one of the things that, you know, I think part of the point, I mean, I'm just thinking not to get too much into the technical stuff, but controlling for crime, controlling for education, so on, it's kind of what economists might call, I mean, a bad control, quote unquote, right? Because,
Right.
I mean, that's part of the issue. I mean, the part of the,
Yep.
I mean, the, bad education doesn't happen just because. Bad education happens because of lack of investment. And lack of investment is a result of, right? So, you know, the first thing that comes in the mind of a policymaker, I guess, is that in those circumstances, what you should have is a system where you transfer resources from the richest neighborhoods to the poorest neighborhoods, or the richest cities to the poorest cities, so that you can compensate. But that's something that it's not happening, or it hasn't happened, right?
Right. You know, let's look at education, for instance. Throughout the 20th century, there's been an effort for whites not to live next to Black people or go to school with Black people. And that helped shape the way we finance education. So in the way we finance education, a large chunk of it comes through, like we talked about before, through property taxes. But many different school districts are located in essentially segregated neighborhoods. So some school districts have much more money to give to their students than others. A lot of that occurred because of what I call the policy violence through segregation and hoarding mechanisms that many communities essentially fund themselves through. And so instead of a system, and this is a policy choice that we can make, we can actually essentially have a single repository where property taxes go towards, and then we distribute based on maybe the income of the student population, the level of wealth or resources in a community, we can distribute resources more equitably. And the reason why we should do that is because, look, education is one of those things. If you, if a person doesn't get a quality education in the front end, we're all going to be paying for it on the back end. And so there's some goods that we should be more, that should be more communal in nature and less private in nature. And schools are just one example of how we need to change policy to reflect communal needs instead of individual goals.
So is that happening in I mean, that would be a state level decision, you think, or it will be is that happening? So, I mean, are there some states that maybe are doing a better job at that, or not?
Well,
not
right now there are several states that are in litigation that are trying to change the state funding formulas. In the US, we don't have a federal education system. We have state education systems. So states generally can do what they want, and under our Constitution, they're essentially responsible for education. So states can create new funding formulas, but many states would have to go through their own constitutional change, creating amendments, which is a heavy lift, especially considering that many middle-class families don't want to change the current arrangement because they see it as hurting them and their district and their schools and their child ultimately. But what we're missing again, you know, and you alluded to this, nothing grows without investment. You need investment. And what we've learned in this COVID moment in particular, when our neighbors are sick, we are then vulnerable. And that's true in education and economics.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
There's some things that we must look out for our neighbors for long-term success of a state and a country. And right now, if you live in a Black neighborhood, more than likely you're getting less funding for education, you're getting less money for social services, and all of these things then end up putting more money, disproportionate amount of money into policing, which in this country right now, people are hearing that the calls to defund the police. And my response to that is, policing as a agency of investment doesn't necessarily lead to economic mobility for residents.
Right.
It's one of those things that you would rather invest in teachers because they're going to excite human capital growth among students. But if you invest in policing, you're literally arresting economic mobility to a certain extent if you're not getting quality, especially.
Right.
So for me,
I want to, on investing in particular, because one of the things that actually your book, again, here for everybody who's joining, Know Your Price, get on Amazon or any other bookstore.
Try to go local. Try to go local.
Try to go local. So one of the things that you challenge me as an economist is the story of your hometown.
Yeah.
Right, because you were saying your hometown actually experienced which is
Wilkinsburg.
I'm terrible with
Wilkinsburg.
Okay, sorry, I'm terrible with pronunciations of
No, you're
good.
good.
So Washington is as far as I can get in pronunciation. No, just kidding. So you describe it as a very lovely neighborhood that is your home, but then you start telling that it's it's a suburb of Pittsburgh, basically, or very close to Pittsburgh. And then when private investments started to fall in, and bigger firms started coming, and maybe fancier restaurants and all the things that as an economist, you challenged me because you always thought that these things, this urban development usually that happens in a city where more investment is coming in, usually benefits everybody. But you're saying, hey, it's actually hurtful to some extent because it's not taking into account I don't know if I'm expressing it right, but it's not taking into account the the challenges and also like the vision of what the residents of that place, you were talking in particular about the Black majority, want their place to become, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you challenge me by saying, this is the question, you challenge me by saying, you know, maybe that framework of, you know, just investing in a place and trickling down and everything's going to be better for everybody is actually, could be actually quite the opposite. It could be actually quite hurtful to people that have been living there for a while.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The research is clear that for low wage work, whenever there's sort of big tech that comes into town, the reason why we provide tax incentives for these companies was for the promise that it would increase opportunity in wages for particularly for lower income residents. And that's just not happening anywhere in the country. You're seeing wage stagnation, but housing costs in particular go up dramatically. So you essentially end up pushing those potential workers out. And so a lot of what we should be doing is figuring out on the front end, how can we use tax incentives to benefit people who may not work in that company? Because what's clear is that if, again, this goes back to the original, what you said earlier, nothing grows without investment. If a company lands and there's really no investment in the people in that area, we're seeing in real time that group suffers significantly. So we just have to be very deliberate. If you come to town and you're
because they can be part of the supply chain of that new company. I mean, there's no way that
Absolutely.
they can. Right. And so a lot of companies nowadays are coming out with statements that they're now want to, you know, make things for the better. I mean, what are the practical steps? I mean, if Google wants to come into a city, a Black majority city, I mean, is there anything that you know, policy wise can be thought of? How can they do it in a way that promotes inclusive growth? Because you know, it's a big question, I know. And we just have a few minutes, but the point is that, you know, I relate a lot to that because I'm a development economist, right? And we have thought about poverty around the world for a long time, and for many decades, people have thought that, you know, what you're saying, I mean, some people are poor maybe because they're making the wrong decisions, but you know, that's not the case. I mean, there's a whole context that is just keeping people, you know, not able to move up in that social mobility ladder.
That's right.
And so it's very similar in that case. And you know, the context, even if you bring a big firm, bring a tons of investment, it doesn't mean that, you know, whoever lives there can actually benefit from that, because if they're not providing a service to the firm, if they don't have the skills, or they don't have a way to get the skills to work in the firm, you know, it's like two stories happening at the same time. Is there anything that, you know, from a firm perspective or from a government perspective, I mean, how can you bridge that gap, if at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's remember that some of these larger publicly traded companies, who's on their board determines where their company investments end up going. And we know that representation matters when it comes to determining where those investments are going to go. So one of the things I've been saying is not enough to just have a statement about diversity or even set up a fund for Black Lives Matter. While those things are important and I appreciate them, it's also important for these larger companies to do the internal work of making sure they diversify their boards. And let's not forget, let's do an internal audit of how they're paying employees and the benefits they're receiving. Because if we did an audit, you would probably see that many larger companies have lots of people on their labor roles that are severely underpaid or not getting benefits. You know, a company like Walmart, for instance, could dramatically alter the lives of Americans with a wage increase. Now, certainly, that will impact bottom lines, no question about it.
Right.
But there has to be some sense of corporations are a part of this problem. There's something
Right.
about the growth model that has occurred over the last few years that's creating divestment in some communities and overinvestment in others. And at this point, we're trying to figure out how can we get not just one-time charity gifts during times of crisis, because remember, companies are great at selling you things, and nobody wants to be perceived as racist. So you're seeing lots of companies say, look at my diversity, I'm giving $10 million, $20 million, $100 million to this fund. And that's great. But after December, when we're looking back and say, what happened to that money? We did not create a real strategy for really fundamentally changing the way we invest in communities. And so this goes, and my next answer is going to go towards taxation in this country. Clearly, we need, for radical change, we need programs and initiatives. We need housing programs, educational programs, and that money's not just going to appear from under a rock. At some point, we have to have a serious conversation about how we tax wealth in this country, because it's clear, and many of your colleagues have pointed this out, people have used their wealth to further advantage themselves in terms of tax policy. And now we need a correction for that. We need more resources to go into housing. We need more resources so that we can have lower cost education, free education, a higher education in some cases. And I didn't mention the wealth gap, which is in terms of in America, black-white wealth gap. It's about 10 to 1 white to black, a median household wealth of 170,000 compared to about 17,000 for blacks. So at some point, you have to have a conversation about generating revenue and wealth, but also eliminating debt if we're ever going to really close that gap. And so we do need some kind of student loan debt reduction plan, which is straddling, or student debt straddling so many young people from really accruing wealth over time. We do need, right, and particularly this moment in time, we need to invest in low-income residents, because low-income residents are actually going to spend and excite the economy. Similar to after the Depression, these low-interest housing loans actually got us out of the Depression, or helped get us out of the Depression. There were other factors, but that was a major a stimulus plan for the country to get us up out. And so the same is true today, that those policies that came out of the New Deal legislation in the past can generally be applied, those principles can be applied today. We can invest in communities that have been penalized by past policy in ways to excite economic activity, to get us out of this recession, impending recession, and most importantly, do the morally right thing. I mean, we often talk at Brookings in terms of money, but let's be clear, this is also a moral issue. That
there's no doubt. Yeah.
We go to work, we live to actually have healthy communities. And right now, structurally, that's just not happening. So we got to change the economy in ways to make sure that people really do have a chance of the American dream. Right now, there's too many people that do not.
So one of the policy ideas that you brought up, I mean, some other people have, but you written about this extensively in the past few months, that I think it relates to that, is the idea of reparations.
Yeah.
Because I think it goes straight to that, because at the end of the story, you want to find a way to invest in people in a way, that really gives them also the freedom to it's not just a one-time investment. It's not just an investment on one thing, which is education, but
Sure.
then you don't fix the other things. So then you're not actually, I mean, it's a very complicated issue that it's so bad in so many different ways that you have to invest, you know, comprehensively in many things. And I actually do think, as an economist, that reparations is kind of the best possible solution to that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I want to hear you about it. But,
Well,
but you know, there's the one thing I want to say is that, you know, for some people it might sound a crazy idea, but there is this huge research that is happening today on mostly on developing countries on poverty, and they found that actually just giving cash to poor people is kind of the best possible investment in themselves that they can have. I mean, after decades of programs to improve housing and improve you know, schools and all that, I mean, just handing out cash to poor people seems to be one of the most effective ways to deal with poverty. So I mean, it's a very different context, and the reparations, of course, has a huge moral aspect to it. So I'm interested I mean, if you can, you know, get us a little bit into this idea, because I think that's the idea of this decade.
Yeah, you know, I explained it to one of my neighbors who's against reparations, and I asked why, and they just said that, well, I didn't discriminate against anybody. Well, I said,
Yeah.
well,
Let's just, sorry to interrupt, but I actually do want to say what reparation is, because I just went into it without explaining it. So why don't you start us off with that, in case people don't know it?
Yeah, reparations is essentially the way that countries can atone for past policy atrocities. That when there's an injury caused by the government's policies, then countries have taken upon themselves to essentially provide restitution for those damages. And in the United States context, there's several cases for damages. There's the damages for lost wages during slavery. There's the damages caused by Jim Crow segregation, so the period after slavery where there was legalized segregation. There's also cases to be made for what we were talking about earlier in terms of housing discrimination, criminal justice discrimination, and other areas where it's clear that policy was tilted negatively towards Black people.
Systematic lack of investment.
That's right.
On these communities. Yeah.
So
this would be like I mean, one way to implement this is just to give like an allowance, cash to families or to individuals that belong to these to Black communities. Is that a way to think about reparations? Okay.
Like you said, you know, we say it very plainly. We say cut the check. That there is a lot of evidence that suggests cash payment actually helps families lift up and helps the economy overall. And so there's cash payments, but then there are also things like, can fall in this category, things like baby bonds, where each person is born with a federally backed savings account, in which after each year, the federal government drops more money into that account, and then the person can take that money out and use it in different ways that he or she sees fit. When they turn 18, they can use it for a down payment in the house. They can go to college with it. But the point there is that we need some kind of Social Security mechanism, and one that is not necessarily attached to housing. Remember, housing used to essentially serve that role for a long period of time. People got a home, they accrued wealth in it, they passed it on to their children. Right now, there's so many areas in the country that it is almost cost prohibitive to buy a home. And so you need other ways to accrue wealth. And so that can, the baby bonds is another alternative. You can have reparations in the form of educational benefits. And so Black Americans should be able to go to higher ed institutions for free. And because many of these institutions, and you see this at Georgetown University here in DC, they have a reparations program because they sold slaves to cover their losses when the university is about to collapse. And so they extend free tuition to the descendants of the slaves, of the enslaved during that period. So we actually have mechanisms and ways to determine if you qualify for reparations. For instance, it's easy to see if you lived in one of the red line districts, the zones in which the federal government determined that was too risky to let out low interest home loans. And by the way, many of those places were majority Black. And so we can tell, we can look in the records, there's adequate enough records to see if someone lived in this home. We have ways to figure out if you're a descendant of the enslaved. So we have ways to figure it out, and we actually have metrics. And so we know that the wealth gap is largely a result of a lack of investment in Black people systemically. And so one of the goals would be to close that wealth gap. Now, it would take more than that, 170,000 to essentially close the gap. But we're talking about having some kind of systemic program where we're providing direct investment in people and direct investment in terms of access to institutions that all people can tap into, so that folks can actually have a chance at the American dream. So reparations is real. And by the way, Black Americans in this country are the only group to not receive them. I mean, just a few years ago, 9/11, September 11 victims received a form of reparations. The Japanese during internment camps received reparations. Many Native American tribes receive reparations. Blacks are the only group that have not received reparations.
So what do you hear when you voice this idea and some people, tell you they're against it? You were telling me that story. So what's the typical?
Oh, yeah.
I can imagine 100 different arguments of why somebody would be against it, but not that they're right. But what is the typical?
Well, the most
argument?
one is the number one thing is, I didn't own any slaves. I didn't discriminate. Well,
Right.
There's easy. It's like, look, I'm not asking you for reparations. I'm asking the federal government for reparations. That they did advance privileges to some and not others. And so there's a long history of doing race-based policy making in this country. But when it comes to addressing Black suffering, there's a reticence. And because in that conversation with my neighbor, I said, look, this person actually complained about not getting a federal response because of COVID and because of social distancing. I said, try being socially distanced for 200 years. For you would see that there's some need for relief, stimulus, whatever you want to call it, reparations. But clearly, we know when in this pandemic that when there's a systemic problem in this country that needs the federal government to step up, and that's, by the way, we pay taxes for, federal taxes for, they should deliver to help individuals and communities. And so many people who are against reparations are so ahistorical and so individually focused that they forget that much of this country is built upon federal investment, that people's growth, individual growth, their prosperity is a result of federal government's investment. They just have not invested in Black people in the same way it's invested in white people. And what we're asking for is to deliver what you're doing every single day for other people, but to do it for Black Americans.
Right. In a way that compensates, of course, what has been happening until now. I do think that's the idea of this decade. But then, how do you think this? I guess under this administration, it's just impossible to even think about it. But do you think that this is something that, first of all, this is something that has to be done at the federal level, that's
Right,
for
right.
sure.
It has to, yeah.
And do you see, I mean, from you've been following the campaign, is this a topic that actually has been floating around, this idea, and it's something that you think it's feasible if there's a change of government in the US in the next few years?
Oh, absolutely. There is a chance. I don't think that any one president, Biden or anyone else, potential president, will do this on their own. That it will come because people are demanding it. And right now, for the first time in my life, I've never seen white people marching in the streets yelling Black Lives Matter. I've never seen it, anything like this. Typically, when something happens, you see the Black community really taking charge of the protests. But everywhere I look,
That's
DC, I mean,
optimistic.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
that's an
like
optimistic. Yeah.
my son who's 9. I love the idea that he saw thousands of people yelling Black Lives Matter. When I grew up, it was the exact opposite. that
Right.
that everything I saw was Black people did not matter. In order for you to achieve, you have to go to a white institution. You have to do things this way. Now we're in a place where we see that we've been stifling innovation, we've been stifling growth, we've been hurting Black people, killing Black people in some cases because of structural racism. It's really time to show people that, hey, this economy can be so much stronger, and we can stop putting the knee in the back, the proverbial knee or the real knee in the back of people's necks in terms of the economy, by actually just being equitable and being less discriminatory. And that's what people are saying
Right.
is, get off my
And
neck
right.
and pay what you're
In
owed.
diversity. Diversity, I've done research on this, and in terms of economic growth, it's a huge force of economic growth.
Yeah.
In terms of innovation, in terms of the ability to produce newer products, and that's something that it's a no-brainer. That, to me, when you invest in communities that have been underinvested chronically for centuries, you're just doing yourself a favor. I'm
And
talking
Dany,
from the point of view of somebody. Yeah.
Yeah, but Dany, I will say this, that we don't do enough research on the benefits of diversity. I think one of the roles that we have to play in public is to show that this is actually a good thing, that people often only see this as a zero-sum game. In some cases, there are zero-sum scenarios, but we have yet to realize what the economy can do if we
Right.
leverage diversity. But we don't talk enough about the benefits of diversity and inclusion, so because it hasn't penetrated the overall psyche of everyday Americans, because they just see,
Right.
oh, this is a threat, and it's not. This is actually a good thing.
Right. Yeah. This has been so enlightening, and I could ask questions for hours and hours. Thankfully, at some point I will see you in the cafeteria, and I will keep asking you questions. But I'm we have a crowd here that I don't want to keep them for much longer. We had some questions here, but we'll take some of those offline, unfortunately, because I took they're saying don't stop, but we have to stop. Andre is a very busy man. He has other stuff. Andre, thank you so much. This has been enlightening. Again, I will do it once more. Buy this book.
Know your price.
It's really challenging. I actually, to my economist colleagues, this has really challenged my view of how the frameworks we typically use. And I think that there's so much here to learn and to reflect about how to do investment in a way that is inclusive. And it's a big challenge. I'm not saying it's easy. And I actually will be following very closely your work on reparations, because I actually do think that that's the policy of this decade. And let me know how else we can help. But with our I mean, it's a common struggle of all of us. achieve justice. I think it's really important.
Well,
Thank
I
you, my
wanted
friend.
to thank you for having me, and I'll see you in the cafeteria soon.
All right. Bye bye. Have a good day. Bye, everyone.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye bye.